December 16th, 1944. Dawn, the Belgian Ardennes. An ancient, silent forest buried beneath a treacherous blanket of snow. This was the quiet front, the ghost front, where the most exhausted American divisions came to recuperate. The supreme irony of the war was about to unfold here. The very place chosen for rest was the precise point where the German High Command had secretly unleashed its most audacious, brutal offensive. The air was so cold, it felt brittle. The only sound, until that moment, had been the metallic creak of trees straining under ice and the rhythmic crunch of boots on frozen ground. Now, that silence was being violently torn apart. The objective was Elsenborn Ridge, a meaningless name on a map for most, but tactically it was the lock and key to the northern shoulder of the entire bulge. If the Americans held, the entire German gambit, the drive to Antwerp, the humiliation of the Allies, the desperate hope of turning the tide, would collapse. And yet, this critical sector was held by troops who believed they were on holiday. In the midst of the chaos, we find the 2nd Infantry Division, specifically one of its forward outposts, Company E. They were overwhelmed not just by the unexpected armored thrust, the heavy grinding advance of the panzer divisions, but by the sheer psychological terror of facing an enemy they thought was defeated. They told us, one artilleryman later recalled, his voice a tremor, that the Wehrmacht was broken, that these were old men and boys. What came out of the fog that morning were fanatics, fresh, screaming like demons. The company commander, Captain Davies, a man whose face had aged a decade in a single hour, watched as 4 desperate attempts to establish a forward observation post on the vital knoll, designated Hill 420, had been annihilated. 40 men, trained soldiers, sent into the White Hell, vanished. Each position was vital. Each failure moved the clock closer to a full-scale rout. This was the crisis point. Hill 420 offered the only line of sight for the American artillery to suppress the burgeoning German supply lines moving through the valleys. Without eyes on target, the guns were blind, and the panzers would roll on unopposed. The German engineers understood this implicitly. They saturated the knoll with heavy machine gun fire, mortars, and most effectively their own sharpshooters. The Americans had the numbers, but the Germans had the cover, the initiative, and, critically, the mindset. They were fighting for survival, and their Jagdkommandos, their hunter teams, were ruthless. Davies' voice was a raw shout over the radio. "We need someone to hold 420, not for an hour, for the night. Give us coordinates. If you're a real soldier, hold this line alone." It was a cry of pure desperation, meant as an impossible challenge. And then, a quiet voice, almost a whisper over the static, answered. That voice belonged to Sergeant James Sullivan, a man known less for grand heroics and more for his almost unnatural stillness. They called him Ghost because he moved through the woods like a shadow and rarely spoke a word. Sullivan was an anomaly, armed with the newly deployed, highly modified M1C Garand. This weapon was not the standard infantry rifle. It was the American answer to the precise terror of the German bolt-action K98 and the powerful optics of the ZF-41. The M1C was semi-automatic, fed by an 8-round en-bloc clip, a significant technological advantage in a rapid-fire engagement, and equipped with the M84 telescope, providing two-power magnification. The irony? The general infantry often distrusted the sniper rifle. It was seen as an oddity, a weapon for special jobs, not for holding a critical defensive line. The common wisdom was that a machine gun was needed to stop a determined advance. The military doctrine said 40 men were required. What the entire German High Command did not yet grasp, was that in the claustrophobic, snow-choked forests of the Ardennes, where visibility was measured in dozens of yards, the sniper was not a skirmisher. He was a strategic weapon. A single, unseen shot could halt a column, paralyze a command, and, most importantly, shatter the enemy's will. Sullivan was about to prove that sometimes one man with the right technology and the right nerve is an army unto himself. If you are compelled by the moments where a single decision shapes the fate of nations, where strategy meets the sharp end of technology and human endurance, subscribe to our channel. Every week, we peel back the layers of history to find the ghosts of the past and the lessons they still hold. Now, let's follow the ghost into the woods. The narrative now shifts to the meticulous preparation of Sergeant Sullivan. This act dissects the symbiotic relationship between the soldier, his weapon, and the unforgiving terrain. Precision is paramount here. The details of the M1C Garand. The standard M1 Garand was already the definitive rifle of the war, unmatched in its combination of firepower and reliability. The M1C, however, was a different beast. It was defined by the offset scope mount, necessitated by the top-loading nature of the Garand's clip. This Griffin and Howe mount was a feat of engineering, ensuring that the rifle's zero remained absolute, even after rapid-fire sequences or heavy handling, a critical factor for sustained accuracy in freezing conditions. Sullivan treated his rifle not as a tool, but as a living extension of himself. We explore his process: the careful application of whale oil to the moving parts to prevent freezing, the calibration of the M84 scope, compensating for the cold air density, and the selection of his rounds, mostly M2 ball ammunition, but with a few specialized armor-piercing rounds reserved for specific high-value targets. The M1C was born out of grudging necessity, according to one American ordnance historian. Our generals loved mass production. They didn't like specialized craft. But the Germans made us realize that one well-placed bullet was cheaper and more effective than 100 mortar shells. Sullivan was one of the few who fully utilized the gun's inherent speed. He wasn't just a shooter, he was a strategic interrupt. Sullivan moved into the Ardennes with the silent, practiced grace of a predator. He was not looking for a foxhole. He was searching for the perfect firing solution. He understood that in the dense woods, the key was not camouflage per se, but blending with the background texture and breaking up his silhouette. His chosen location on Hill 420 was an overturned root system of an ancient beech tree, providing a natural, hardened firing platform and a small, narrow lane of sight down the valley road, the exact artery the German supply chain needed to use. He buried the majority of his supplies, extra ammunition, concentrated rations, in the hard snow, leaving only the essentials on his person. His strategy was simple, but brutally effective: become invisible. The sound of his shots, the signature ping of the M1 Garand's clip ejecting, must be separated from his location by distance and time. On the opposing side, the German advance was led by a Zugführer, platoon leader, Lieutenant Klaus Richter, a veteran of the Eastern Front, a man who had seen entire Soviet companies dissolved by unseen rifle fire. He respected the ghost. He knew the initial advance was easy, but the inevitable single points of resistance were the true killers. The German snipers, often using the Mauser K98 with the powerful though cumbersome Zeiss optics, were trained to kill the command structure first, but their philosophy was different. One shot, move. Their rifles were precise but slow to reload. The American M1C was slower to zero but offered a rapid-fire capability that terrified them. We learned quickly in Russia, Richter's actual diary later detailed, that a sniper is a psychological weapon. But the Americans, they are different. When a man fights alone, he is reckless. He will not be a patient shot, he will be an assassin. We expected to be hunted by a team. To be stalled by a single rifle meant something else entirely. It meant they were sending a madman. The challenge on Hill 420 was not just to defeat the American advance, it was to silence the single rifle that was about to turn the knoll into a meat grinder. The psychological game had begun. The hunter was now the anchor of the American defense, and the German advance was walking directly into his crosshairs. The fight was about to transition from a clash of divisions to a duel of shadows. The darkness of pre-dawn began to fracture. The air was filled not just with the cold, but with the distinct heavy sound of tank tracks, the grinding, deliberate approach of German armor. Specifically, the heavy angled bulk of a Panther Ausf. G, a tank that terrified the American light armor. It was the vanguard for a column of supply trucks and supporting infantry attempting to secure the road below Hill 420. Sullivan, now completely fused with the root system, waited. His target was not the tank. His round could not penetrate its frontal glacis. His target was the command. The German infantry were professional, advancing in staggered formation, checking the tree line for tripwires and booby traps. They were confident that the American perimeter had either retreated or been wiped out. They were complacent. The lead Panther commander, standing exposed in his turret for better situational awareness, was the first casualty. A sudden, sharp crack, the specific sound of the M1C firing heavy grain ammunition, shattered the morning air. The commander collapsed instantly, the bullet striking with surgical precision. The effect was immediate and total. The Panther, suddenly blind and driverless, veered violently, smashing into a supporting half-track loaded with critical ammunition. The resulting secondary explosion illuminated the forest like a flashbulb. Panic was contained, but the command structure was severed. The German infantry, members of the elite 2nd Panzer Division, knew the enemy was close, but the silence after the ping was agonizing. Sullivan's strategic objective was disruption, not attrition. His next shots were methodical, focused entirely on the radio operators and field officers. A Gefreiter, Lance Corporal, attempting to use a field telephone to call for artillery support. Eliminated. A non-commissioned officer trying to reorganize the scattered infantry. A bullet to the head. Within 5 minutes, 7 shots had been fired, 7 casualties, all high value. The column was stalled, the command paralyzed. Lieutenant Richter, further back in the column, was furious. "It's a single rifle, a single man, find the bastard!" he screamed, realizing that the American had chosen his targets based on tactical value, not proximity. The German soldiers were now facing the most terrifying enemy, one they could not see or locate. They began to fire wildly into the surrounding trees, tearing apart the bark, but revealing nothing. The snow, falling lightly again, absorbed the sound, making the origin of the rifle fire almost impossible to pinpoint. Sullivan's mindset. Fictionalized historical insight based on accounts. The sniper wasn't just shooting, he was data processing. He observed the column, noting the time taken for a man to move from one tree to another, the specific flash pattern of the German muzzle brakes, and the exact coordinates of the Panther's immobilization. He was building a predictive model of the enemy's reaction. He waited for the inevitable German counter-sniper team. He knew they would send one. It was a matter of honor and doctrine. He used the brief silence, the moment of frozen German confusion, to reload his primary ammunition and, crucially, to use his trenching tool to slightly adjust the snow embankment around his firing position, ensuring a clean field of fire for the next wave. This was not a glorious brawl, it was a deadly calculated exercise in ballistics, patience, and tactical geography. The 40 men who failed were expected to hold a line. Sullivan was holding a bottleneck, one precise kill at a time. The first blood had been drawn, and the Germans were reeling from the shock of meeting a professional ghost where they expected a retreating rabble. The Germans were not easily deterred. Lieutenant Richter, recognizing the severity of the problem, deployed his most effective countermeasure. A dedicated hunter-killer team, Jagdkommando, led by a decorated Unteroffizier, sergeant, specializing in counter-sniping, armed with the formidable, short-barreled K98K with a ZF-42 telescopic sight. The German strategy was simple. Pin the American down with coordinated machine gun fire, then use 2 stalkers to circle wide through the woods, flanking the presumed position and forcing the sniper to reveal his location or retreat. The German snipers were known for their superior optics. The ZF-42, a 4x scope, offered a distinct advantage over the American 2x M84 in terms of magnification, but it was mounted high and required the bolt-action reload, making rapid fire impossible. The duel was now a direct comparison of philosophies, German optical power versus American semi-automatic speed. The Jagdkommando began by saturating the tree line with sustained, heavy fire from an MG-42, the famed Hitler's buzzsaw, capable of firing over 1,200 rounds per minute. The noise was deafening, the impact cratering the earth around Sullivan's position. Sullivan's crucial advantage now was his flash hider and the speed of his follow-up shots. He allowed the Germans to pin him, but instead of firing back directly, he used his rifle to target the weakest link in their coordinated attack. He identified the MG-42 assistant gunner, the man responsible for feeding the belt and changing the overheated barrel. Waiting for a moment of slight exposure as the assistant bent to replace a canister, Sullivan fired, not at the head, but at the hip, a shot designed to cause maximal, incapacitating pain, forcing the two remaining snipers to momentarily break cover to drag their comrade away. As the Unteroffizier moved to provide covering fire for the retreat, Sullivan had his moment. He fired two quick shots, the Garand's semi-automatic action singing. The first shot missed, kicking snow near the German's helmet. The second, calculated to compensate for the German's immediate dive for cover, grazed his shoulder. The German sniper was not killed, but he was forced to drop his K98K, his primary weapon. The strategic effect was achieved. The elite counter-sniper team was neutralized, and the element of surprise was lost. The Germans were left with only one recourse: direct frontal assault by the infantry, who were still stalled by the destroyed column. They launched a desperate, screaming rush up the snowy slope, relying on momentum and close-quarters aggression. This was the moment the M1C's semi-automatic advantage became a terrifying, industrial killing tool. Sullivan did not take aim. He suppressed. He fired clip after clip into the mass of advancing men, aiming low, creating trip hazards out of bodies, and shredding the momentum of the advance. The signature ping of the ejecting clip became, for the advancing Germans, the sound of doom. Richter's realization, based on historical accounts of American snipers. Lieutenant Richter, observing from below, realized the scale of the Americans' tactical genius. He is not concerned with the kill count, he noted in his report. He is concerned with the pace of our advance. Every shot is a brake pedal. We cannot advance past the choke point without first neutralizing this one rifle. The duel of shadows had ended in a decisive, bloody win for the technological advantage of the semi-automatic rifle. Sullivan held the knoll alone, not through brute force, but by surgically applying precision and maximizing the Garand's fire rate in a way the Germans could not match with their bolt-action weapons. The line was held, but the German panzers were regrouping. The success of Sullivan's solitary action bought the American artillery commander, Major Thompson, the precious time needed. With the German advance stalled, Company E was able to bring a communications wire up the backside of Hill 420. The tactical objective had been achieved. The eyes were in place. The first volley of American 105mm shells screamed over Sullivan's head, impacting the German assembly area further down the valley road with devastating accuracy. The shockwaves alone were enough to flatten the snow around Sullivan. The German advance was now pinned between an unseen, lethal sniper and a deluge of accurate, heavy ordnance. The narrative now shifts to the essential, unglamorous work of survival and logistics. Holding the line meant more than just shooting. It meant engineering an absolute defensive position. Sullivan used the temporary ceasefire. The Germans were too busy finding cover from the artillery to reinforce his position. He faced a critical problem. The Garand's clip ping was loud and directional, giving away his position. He utilized a simple, yet brilliant, engineering solution. He lined the ejection port of the M1C with heavy canvas, carefully taping it so the clip was caught before hitting the frozen ground. The iconic ping was muffled, replaced by a dull, almost silent thud. The ghost was now truly silent. We examined the other tools of his trade. The M3 trench knife, essential for digging shallow, icy ground. The periscope, a small, battered trench periscope, allowing him to observe the German movement without exposing his head to potential counter-snipers who might have survived. The rationing strategy. He ate only frozen K-rations and snowmelt, understanding that the metabolic activity would generate heat and, crucially, vapor, a lethal giveaway in the sub-zero air. He did not fire unless he had a 90% certainty of a high-value strike. The German command was now fully aware that the northern shoulder of the Bulge was being stalled by this single point of resistance. The sheer volume of accurate American artillery fire proved that someone was on that knoll. A German supply sergeant's captured diary entry reveals the sheer psychological toll. The artillery is terrible, but the silence afterwards is worse. We know he is up there. We hear nothing, see nothing. But when the colonel steps into the open to look at the map, the sound of that single specific rifle is the sound of death. It is demoralizing. We fight an invisible man, and he is better than all of us combined. The challenge for the Germans now was to identify the method behind the madness. They believed the American was moving, darting from position to position, a standard tactic. They sent patrols to sweep the woods, only to find themselves moving into carefully pre-sighted kill zones. Sullivan was proving a critical military thesis. The sniper is not defined by his rifle, but by his absolute mastery of terrain and his ability to exploit technological advantages, like the M1C's semi-auto action, to dictate the pace of a conventional engagement. He wasn't a hero yet. He was a machine of cold, detached logic. But the true test, a final, determined armored push, was coming at dawn. The Battle of the Bulge was, at its heart, a race against time for the Germans. The longer they were stalled, the more American reserves would arrive. Lieutenant Richter received a direct, non-negotiable order: clear Hill 420 immediately. The final assault was a combined arms operation, designed to overwhelm the assumed position with sheer force. 2 Panzer IV Ausf. J tanks, accompanied by a company of veteran German paratroopers, Fallschirmjäger, advanced under the cover of smoke and heavy mortar fire. This time, the Panzers kept their commanders buttoned up, refusing to offer a target. The entire American defense on the northern shoulder depended on the next half hour. If Hill 420 fell, the German forces could flank the main line. Sullivan knew he couldn't stop the tanks with his standard ammunition. He was forced to use his reserves of M2 armor-piercing, AP rounds. These rounds were typically reserved for light armor or exposed engine blocks. They would not penetrate the thick side or front armor of the Panzer IV. His target was ingenious and based on a rarely exploited technological vulnerability: the elevation gears and main sighting optics of the Panzer IV. These components, critical for firing the main 7. 5 semi-automated KWK-40L48 cannon were protected only by thin covers, or, in the case of the optics, glass. The 1st Panzer IV advanced, its main gun traversing, searching for the source of the resistance. Sullivan took a deep breath, sighting through his 2x scope, compensating for the cold and the tank's slow, rhythmic movement. Crack. The AP round struck the exposed main gun sight port. The glass shattered, the optics blinded. The Panzer IV was now firing purely on guesswork. Crack. The 2nd round struck the barrel collar, fouling the delicate mechanism of the gun's recoil assembly. The Panzer, its main cannon now useless and its vision compromised, halted in confusion. The 2nd Panzer, hesitant to advance past its crippled comrade, also paused. The accompanying Fallschirmjäger launched a furious assault, realizing the tanks were vulnerable. This was the moment of maximum danger. They charged the root system, using the disabled Panzer as cover. The German commander, a captain, was determined. He saw the flash of the M1C from the root system and directed his fire. Sullivan was exposed. The captain raised his MP-40 submachine gun to fire a final burst. In a split second, the kind of timeless decision only a combat veteran can make, Sullivan dropped his now empty M1C and grabbed his M3 trench knife. As the German captain approached the root system, Sullivan exploded out of the snow, not firing, but grappling. It was a savage, silent struggle in the snow. The trench knife, a simple, non-technological instrument, became the final weapon. Sullivan neutralized the captain, not with a bullet, but with pure, brutal, close-quarters combat. The remaining German paratroopers, suddenly leaderless and seeing their objective held by an absolute madman who charged a submachine gun with a knife, broke. They retreated, dragging their dead and wounded, leaving the panzers stranded in the valley. Hill 420 had been held, not by a company, but by a single man's iron will, backed by the strategic application of the semi-automatic rifle and a mastery of technological vulnerabilities. When the American Relief Force, Company G, finally reached the knoll, they found the silence absolute. It was the silence not of peace, but of utter, devastating finality. The only sound was the crunch of their own boots on the frozen snow, a sound loud enough to feel like sacrilege. The snow around the gnarled root system, the unmoving heart of the American defense, was stained a deep, shocking red. and the air carried the lingering sharp smell of burnt cordite, ruptured fuel, and cold iron. They found Sergeant Sullivan sitting beside his position, his back to the shattered beech tree, oblivious to the relief column's arrival. His face was a mask of exhaustion, streaked black with powder residue and camouflage grease. Yet his hands were performing the rhythmic, meticulous task of a highly focused professional, cleaning the M1C Garand. He was reloading the clips one round at a time, his movements slow, deliberate, and utterly steady. He had neutralized the entire armored assault alone for a brutal 14 hours, the strategic window that saved the entire northern flank of the American defense. The area below Hill 420 was now a graveyard of men and metal, a choke point that held not by massed firepower, but by sheer precise technological application. The official records, compiled by stunned intelligence officers, list the estimated high-value targets struck from Hill 420, 29 direct kills, 2 disabled Panzer IV tanks, and 1 disabled half-track, all attributed solely to the silent, unseen sniper. But the crucial legacy of Sullivan's action was not merely the body count, it was the strategic disruption. His individual resolve proved, in the most visceral way, that the German doctrine of overwhelming, concentrated force could be utterly nullified by a single, determined technological agent armed with superior semi-automatic speed. Years later, an engineer from the Springfield Armory, commenting on the unexpected success of the M1C Garand sniper variant, captured the essential truth. We designed the gun for precision. We didn't design it to stop a tank division. Our doctrine called for companies, for artillery batteries. Sergeant Sullivan proved the design was inherently sound in ways we hadn't dared to imagine. He showed that one man, when armed with a rifle that could shoot, and shoot quickly, the decisive advantage of the semi-automatic action, could become the equal of an entire infantry platoon, equipped with less reliable, less rapid weaponry. He didn't just shoot, he suppressed with sniper accuracy. That was a revolution in small arms employment. The Germans, in their desperate and demoralized post-action reports on the failure at Elsenborn Ridge, focused heavily on the phenomenon they couldn't comprehend: the invisible fire, the unsoundable rifle, and the terrifying speed of the American shooting. They initially believed they were facing a newly deployed concealed automated gun nest, or a team of highly coordinated snipers. The ultimate crushing irony was their grudging respect for the weapon they were fighting, the very rifle, the M1 Garand, that their own leadership had previously dismissed as too complicated, too heavy, and too wasteful of ammunition. The Ghost of the Ardennes had been armed with a semi-automatic weapon the Wehrmacht feared they could not match on a mass production scale. Lieutenant Richter's final entry, recovered from a destroyed half-track before he was killed later in the campaign, simply read, "The Ghost was real. He did not fight by the rules of war. He fought by the rules of survival. He was the line. The fear he instilled in us was total because we could not locate him, and therefore we could not advance." The silent hero and the enduring whisper. Sullivan was eventually awarded the Distinguished Service Cross, the second highest decoration for valor, but he never sought the spotlight. He simply returned to duty, a shadow among shadows. The legend of the Ghost of Hill 420 became a powerful, necessary whisper among the beleaguered men of the Ardennes, the story of the one man who, when challenged to hold an impossible line, used a rifle, a knife, and cold, unwavering logic to beat back the elite of the Third Reich. He was the embodiment of the moment when pure human will and technological superiority intersect to change the course of history. The Battle of the Bulge failed precisely because of strategically held choke points like Hill 420. Sullivan's defense was a microscopic action that had a macroscopic effect, proving that strategy is often decided not by the clash of a million men, but by the cold, precise dedication of one man. The ultimate long-term consequence of Sergeant Sullivan's tactical hold was that it forced the German command to delay their advance for the crucial 48 hours required for the weather to clear. The immediate strategic victory for the Allies was not just the holding of the line, but the sudden, catastrophic unleashing of the technological beast overhead, the Allied Air Force. When the thick, insulating cloud cover of the Ardennes finally broke, What descended upon the stalled German columns was not a human enemy, but an industrial one. The skies were suddenly filled with the roar of the P-47 Thunderbolt, a massive, rugged fighter bomber now deployed in overwhelming numbers for ground attack. The Thunderbolt, often dismissed early in the war for its sheer size and heavy weight, proved its true worth in the Schlachtflieger, ground attack role. It was the perfect, terrifying technological counterpoint to the German armored divisions trapped below. The Thunderbolt's armament was a testament to industrial overkill. 8 50-caliber machine guns, the same caliber as Sullivan's M1C, but multiplied by 8, firing well over 1,000 rounds per minute per gun. This was the equivalent of a devastating airborne wall of metal, capable of turning heavy vehicles into Swiss cheese, supplemented by up to 2,500 pounds of bombs and devastating high-velocity aircraft rockets, HVARs. The industrial reality was simple. While Sullivan held the line for 14 hours with 8-round clips, the American factories produced thousands of P-47s and tens of millions of rounds of ammunition, ready to obliterate any target exposed to clear skies. The Germans were fighting a war of quality. The Americans were fighting a war of scale. For every highly engineered but slow-to-produce Panther AUSF-G tank the Germans produced, the Americans could manufacture 10 P-47s, P-51s, or Shermans. The German High Command's final desperate gamble at the Bulge was not just defeated by an individual soldier. It was defeated by the overwhelming, inevitable weight of the American industrial machine, patiently waiting for its signal, and finally unleashed by that single soldier's bravery. Sergeant Sullivan's action had a profound, albeit subtle, influence on post-war military doctrine. His success with the semi-automatic M1C against a coordinated conventional force confirmed a new truth. The sniper was not a romantic relic of the previous war, but a strategic force multiplier, a one-man artillery battery. The U.S. military's continued development of dedicated sniper rifles, culminating in the adoption of precision systems like the M40 and the focus on specialized intensive training, was a direct echo of the cold, hard lessons learned by the Ghost of Hill 420. The need for absolute silent operation, eliminating the muzzle flash and the ping, guaranteed technological precision, and high-quality variable power optics became non-negotiable standard requirements. The psychological and strategic power of the single, unseen shot was now firmly enshrined in modern military doctrine. Sullivan returned home, quietly slipping back into civilian life, one of the countless unsung heroes who won the war not with a flag-waving charge, but with cold, calculated efficiency. The iron will of one man, backed by a superior piece of technology in his hands, had forced a multi-million-man, multi-billion-dollar offensive to grind to a halt. His story remains a perfect example of the intersection of strategy, technology, and human resilience. In the end, the captain's desperate shout, "If you're a real soldier, hold this line alone," was answered not by a hero seeking glory, but by a consummate professional soldier who understood that in the right place, at the right time, one man with a superior rifle is all that is required to change the course of history. The stories of the Second World War are filled with grand battles and sweeping campaigns, but the true drama lies in the trenches, in the cockpits, and, as we've seen, behind a single silent rifle. If the fusion of human endurance, tactical genius, and technological detail moves you, subscribe to our channel. Share this story, and join us next time as we uncover another critical, unseen moment where an ordinary soldier made an extraordinary difference.